Hi, so I'm Emily, and I just want to talk to you a little bit about my experience of myelofibrosis and my bone marrow transplant, which I had 3.5 years ago. When I was diagnosed with myelofibrosis in 1999, there wasn't really the network or the information or anything like the MPN network that there is today, and it would have been fantastic if there was, because it was quite a isolating and sort of uncertain route for many years. So when I was preparing for my bone marrow transplant, I was buddied up with Chris Harper through the MPN forum, and that was fantastic for me to be able to ask questions and kind of get information about what it was like to go through it. And I sort of decided that when I came through it all, which is kind of now, that I would talk about my experience and become a buddy myself, which I've done. So diagnosis was almost exactly 18 years ago. My eldest daughter has just turned 18, and she was 6 weeks old when I was diagnosed with myelofibrosis. I discovered this large kind of lump in my stomach, which turned out to be my spleen, which was really quite big. And then from that, the diagnosis for myelofibrosis came down in Bristol. And Professor Howes, who was fantastic, she did the diagnosis down there. She said two things that I remembered. One was that I would need a bone marrow transplant one day. And the second was, don't look it up on the internet. Don't look anything up. Don't look your condition up on the internet, because you will completely frighten yourself, and you will probably read about things that don't apply to you, because each patient is completely unique with their risks and their context and everything. And you've got nobody there to interpret it for you. So actually, to this day, I've never looked up the condition on the internet, although things are probably different now, but 18 years ago that was the case. Then really it was living with uncertainty for sort of 12, 13 years. It was watch and wait. I remained quite well. My spleen got bigger and bigger. I had regular blood tests, and I actually went on to have a second daughter who's now 15, Molly. And then at some point, probably about 12, 13 years later, a locum doctor in a haematology clinic picked up that my bloods weren't looking quite as they should be, and said I really needed a review. And at that point, I was referred up to Professor Claire Harrison at Guy's. Claire was fantastic. She was very kind and gentle, very firm, and said that I needed to prepare myself for decisions about the bone marrow transplant at that point. I was very lucky to be prescribed the trial drug ruxolitinib, which I was very nervous about taking. When I read all the potential side effects in the information, I thought I might as well keel over now when I saw all the potential side effects. However, it was absolutely fantastic, and I was really well on it, and it reduced my spleen almost like magic. By that point, my spleen was really big, and when I started on the drug, it just shrunk back to and kind of disappeared. And I felt very well on it, and it really gave me an extra year before I had the bone marrow transplant. So I was very lucky in that respect, and I was able to kind of schedule the bone marrow transplant in because I was in a position where I could do that. So we decided to go for May 2014 in the hope that when I came out of isolation that there wouldn't be so many bugs and things around that I could catch. That was when we scheduled it in for. During the time when I was sort of on the trial drug and preparing for the bone marrow transplant, I looked after myself very carefully. I went to see my osteopath for a back injury, and he said, look, you've got this bone marrow transplant coming up. Why don't you look at yourself like an athlete, preparing for your biggest life event, and that you're going for gold? And I found that incredibly helpful, and I thought, yeah, okay, I'm going to go for gold here as much as I can, and it kind of made me feel empowered, really, to think that it wasn't all out of my control, that I could actually do something to help myself. So during that time, I went to see a nutritionist and took very good care of what I ate, took vitamins and minerals, I exercised moderately, and really sort of got almost into training for the big event. So then May 2014 came, and I went into isolation down in Bristol with my husband, came with me. The care I got in Bristol was absolutely second to none. I was in a brand new clinic, a brand new unit that had literally just opened 1 or 2 weeks before, and there were still sort of boxes in the corridors being unpacked. I went into isolation for 4 weeks. It was obviously a real challenge that time, but what I decided was that no matter how rubbish I felt or how poorly, that every day I would get up and have a shower, put my music on, so I'd taken a big playlist with me, and that I would do some very gentle, moving around, stretches and dancing, if I felt up to it, around my room, which was quite large. And I did manage to do that, even if I was hooked up. Every day I would just get up and start moving. And the physio bought me a step, like a training step, so I was kind of doing my training, and one of the consultants came in and said, the more you do that, the more you move, get yourself going, the sooner you'll be out of here. So I definitely think that helped me while I was in isolation. The isolation was an opportunity in a way to really internalise. I actually found that I just wrote about my experience. I didn't actually watch any films or TV in that time. I did an awful lot of, what really helped me was doing a lot of relaxation and breathing exercises and visualizations about my body sort of accepting the new cells and healing and so on. So it was quite a bubble that whole month. And in actual fact, it was harder coming out than going in. Because once I was in this very protective environment where I was being looked after, it was germ-free, but actually coming out after a month was incredibly challenging for me. I'd been brought up with the idea of a peck of dirt being kind of okay, and with animals and so on, and then once you come out of isolation, it's very scary because everything seems, a cough or a sneeze, and you sort of want to run a mile. So that was quite hard. Also what I'd say about that, my two worst fears that I'd been worrying about all those years about the bone marrow transplant were, one was mucositis, which you can get in your sort of gullet from quite moderate to severe, which I didn't actually get. And the other was graft versus host disease, which terrified me. And so far, so good. I haven't had that. There were other things that I did get that I didn't know I could have got, which I could have been worrying about all those years. But what I felt was, in the end, you just deal with what you have to deal with at the time. And I just feel I worried a lot about things that kind of didn't happen. So I came out of isolation and went into a hospital flat, very lucky to be close by the hospital in a flat, with my husband who was coming and going, and then my sister. That was very good to be so close by. And what I decided to do from day one of coming out of isolation was to start walking. So every day I would walk. So whether it was for 5-10 minutes or whether it was for 2 hours, I would just walk. And that was my road to recovery, walking. And sometimes it completely wiped me out, but I got to know the streets of Bristol very well. And it's something I do to this day. I've continued walking. And certainly for that first year, which is the real sort of slow, hard recovery, I was walking all the time, every day. And I still walk with the dog. And I just feel it's really served me well to as part of my road to recovery. The other part of my recovery was creativity. I'm an artist, and the work that I do is with, I'm a huge believer in the power of creativity for well-being. So my creativity alongside the walking was my road to recovery, really. That first year was a really long year, and it really was quite a slog to sort of get to that first year point. But from then, the time's gone very quickly, and I feel so far so good. I feel well, and I've got 2 feisty teenagers and a lot of work. I run my own business and work with creativity and well-being. So the one thing that I would say is Afternoon rests are my top tip. I rested, obviously a huge amount of time when you're going through the treatment, and post-treatment is you've got to rest. You can't do anything but rest. But the afternoon rest itself became a bit of an institution while I was going through the treatment. And I continue to have an afternoon rest, and even though I'm 3.5 years post-transplant, and my consultant in Bristol, Steve Robinson, he always laughs wryly when I say I have my afternoon rest still. But it served me very well. And I think it's, I've just really sort of, the body's been through quite a battering. So it's really the way that I look after myself. And finally, I have written about my experience, and I am in the process of editing it into a sort of what I call a bone marrow transplant survival guide, but it's really just some top tips that I found incredibly helpful on my sort of journey going through the bone marrow transplant. So I will be making that available hopefully quite soon through the network. So that's me.